Welcome to Inside Music Curation. It's Wednesday, it's 1 o'clock in the Pacific time zone, and we are here talking about all things music curation. Today, I am joined by my esteemed colleagues at Feed Media Group, our curation team, or part of it. We've got Arturo. Thanks for joining us today. Mike, Stens, and Dario. These guys are hard at work every day curating music for businesses. At Feed Media Group, we do a lot of work with digital fitness companies, retail companies, making sure that we are connecting their brand and their users with a great musical experience in the digital world. And Inside Music Curation is a chance for us to come together, talk about trends happening in music, in the music industry, and specifically in music for business. And this week we are talking about the 80s, or rather the sound revival of sounds from the 80s coming back today. There have been some big releases coming out, a lot of consistency in new music that we're seeing with nods back to that era. And so we're going to kick it off. I think, music itself is cyclical, generations come and go. But I'd love to just toss it out. Why do you guys think that this 80s revival is so prevalent in some of the big pop albums that are coming out right now?
Well, I tried to get my hair like a flock of seagulls style, but I got it cut, so it's too short to do it, so I couldn't really get there for our special talk today. But I think that a lot of we had talked about this at one point. I feel like music that we listen to as teens, 12, 13, up to 16 years old, that music basically forms our tastes as adults. Generally, it's not like I mentioned to you guys earlier, like, yeah, you can build up an appreciation for jazz in your 30s or 40s, but generally speaking, what you liked as a teen is you're going to take with you. And if you do some quick math, if you were 14 years old listening to music that was coming out in 1985, you're 50 now. Makes me feel like a fossil, but it's true. And I feel like, because that's the music that you took with you along the way. And if you're 50 or so, you may have children in their late teens, early 20s who have grown up listening to the music that you were playing at home, and they are now in turn creating music, obviously using it as an influence.
Yeah, I agree with what Mike is saying, but I also feel that there is this component of similarities, I guess, in these two decades, even if it's they're 40 years apart. And one of them, is the explosion of like technology. Back in the 80s, like we got tons of new technologies, drum machines, synthesizers, keyboards, MIDI, and everybody wanted to have, like a similar sound, and that's why the music from the 80s is so characteristically sound-wise, like especially like the synth music, right? Not so much other styles, and I feel that was a way for artists to create music without having to, and they started using computers as well, so I mean the studios were still relevant, but you were able to do music in a way that it has not happened before. And I guess nowadays that's what how we make music today. We use computers. And to give an example that is in this documentary from the BBC, Synth Britannia, something that I remember caught by surprise is like the fact that Eurythmics, Sweet Dreams, that song was recorded with one microphone. It was a good microphone, Shure SM58, which is like what most recording studios use for that. A synthesizer, just one, and one drum machine. So basically, that's the same tools that a kid might have today to do, music, and the sounds, because it's it's a computer, might be a little bit like in kind of in the same way, because they use their Fruity Loops, Ableton, and they have come with a lot of presets. Even I play, with like stuff online, creating my own music, and I feel like it's easier rather than like obviously learning how to play guitar or learning how to play drums or an instrument. I think there is like this the similarity at these two times, with the explosion of like of technology where, you know, engineers, producers, and musicians started to explore. And that's why I think, you know, we're getting that sound. And maybe for inspiration as well.
Well, I think that's a great example in the sense that, like, you know, that the similarity and the change we were talking about, you know, people using DAWs, Ableton, etc., right? Like, and those presets, right? But who are the programmers that are making those presets? People that grew up listening to music in the 80s. Like,
Right.
so what presets are they going to give you? What synthesizers are they going to focus on? You know, Arturo is a manufacturer that makes a lot of, you know, synth emulators and other things. And the machines that they choose to emulate are all from the 80s. You know, it's Yamahas and Junos and, you know, Oberheims. Like, that's what they're trying to recreate. Yeah, there's the occasional like Mellotron, which reaches a little further back and those sorts of things. But the bulk of when you open one of those big synth, you know, I have it on my laptop, you know, and you open Arturia up and they've got a whole key lab. It's all 80s synthesizers. And those are the sounds that you're getting and creating, you know, and what are driving people who are still making music now and people who are just picking up for the first time. You know, that hardware component of it is just so ingrained in what people are doing. In the same way, if you give 4 people, you know, drums, guitar with the fuzz pedal, bass, and vocals, like, there's a certain kind of sound you're going to get, and you can stretch it in different ways, but you're still going to sort of fit into a general sound mold in conjunction with, if you're now as an artist making music and these are the sounds you're getting, what are you then looking back and hearkening that to? You know, like, what is it about that you're trying to pull out with those sounds? You know, which is, you know, with the same things that the Eurythmics were using, you know, Prince makes something that sounds very different. So it's like, which of those things are you reaching and pulling back for? You know, Ennio makes something that's very different than Sinead O'Connor.
Yeah,
So
whether, you know, go for it, Stens.
I'm so sorry, Melissa. I was just going to tag on to that, which is to say that the dimensions y'all talked about, I mean, Mike, we talk about that sweet spot of age when you develop your taste. I mean, as I couldn't have said it better myself, but we've seen a lot of scientific studies that prove exactly what you said, that there's this age sweet spot when you develop your primary taste, if you will, or your primary musical aesthetic. And then technologically, everything you guys said is dead on. But we also have talked about, too, the socioeconomic climate. And so I think that's interesting because, you know, we've seen the 1980s pop trend happening for a while. We're really talking about pop music right now, just to be clear, because there's trap, there's reggaeton, there's all these amazing other musical styles that are coming together right now to inhabit the space that most people are listening to. But when we talk really about, you know, pop styles, a lot of the leading artists, starting with the pandemic, like Lady Gaga's Chromatica, definitely had some, you know, 1980s influences into it. Dua Lipa had celebrated, you know, her release has been very celebrated for it just being awesome. But that one drew intentionally and knowingly and almost winkingly so on the 1980s. But I think what made us decide as a group, hey, let's talk about this, is not that it's new, but it's continuing. So the Weeknd, you know, After Hours was such a dominant album, Blinding Lights and all those. And you don't have to be a musicologist or a curator to say, hey, that sounds kind of like the 80s. But, you know, he just came back with Dawn FM, which is an awesome album. Highly recommend. You're going to hear it whether you want to or not. I reckon it's going to be on the charts probably for at least the next year because he's just going for the juggernaut. So he basically just decided to double down on the 1980s. And well done. You know, there's more there. The new album is awesome. He even goes so far as to quote one of the, you know, seismic innovators of the 1980s, Quincy Jones, who was the architect of Thriller. And so, you know, there's a skit in his new album that's like, it's like a word with Quincy. I can't remember what it's called, but, you know, the Weeknd's putting it right out there. Like, Quincy Jones is part of my DNA.
Well, that's a great example too, right? Is that, like, when you think about cultural icons musically that people still harken back to, that are institutions, it is people from the 80s. And the Weeknd is very clearly trying to draw the parallel between himself and Michael Jackson, right? In the same way that you have people like, you know, like Lady Gaga and, you know, all these other people that, like, when you think about Madonna, like, those are the people that the mental image that they have when they think about pop star, right? Which is the big component
and
here.
Janelle Monáe and Lizzo and Prince, like just as a couple other examples, it's dominant.
Yeah, and those sort of correlations culturally are what's so important, in the sense that there were other things happening during the 80s, other 80s sounds, new wave, no wave, like punk and all these things, like metal was really starting to come into its own in a few different splinter categories, but there aren't the same sort of cultural institutions. Like nobody's dressing like AC/DC, you know what I mean? Like that's not what they're doing. It's these big pop stars that were sort of larger than life in that sense.
And I think that's when people, you're absolutely right. There were many other genres, in the 80s. But when people think about the 80s, you think about the pop artists, the synth, drum machines, that kind of stuff. And in relation to what Stens was saying about the new album from the Weeknd. I guess for him, for the music that he's trying to do, and also for Dua Lipa, they're not gonna find a lot of inspiration in the 90s music, because that was an answer to the 80s, saying, the 80s sucked, or it was plastic. But they were not, any musicians doing, the kind of music that they probably wanted to do. So then the reference, are back in the 80s, like as you said, like Madonna from the 80s, because Madonna from the 90s is a completely
very different. Exactly.
To what you're saying, I did some other age-related math, and so Weeknd, or the Weeknd, he was born in 1990, and he has mentioned in a couple of interviews that one of his biggest inspirations musically is the video game Grand Theft Auto. Vice City. And if you look, Vice City came out in 2002. So he was 12 or 13 years old, right? So it was imprinting in his mind. What was the music on that game? It was Psychedelic Furs. It was Spandau Ballet. It was Flock of Seagulls. It was Human League. So he, although he was born in the 90s and he missed it when it was actually starting and happening, he used a game from 2002 when he was 12, 13 years old as a reference to what he's.
Well, it goes back to the people making that game. That was the music that they were listening to. And
exactly.
So it's this sort of thing that, and there are these 30-year cycles, but it's changed with technology. So now you get a video, instead of like just a record store and you get the music that's come out from your parents, you're also getting video games that now they're also calling back. And so then it's sort of doubling the loop and creating this sort of feedback mechanism. So we're seeing it sort of ping pong back and forth, and which I think Madonna is a great example of somebody who did change. So the Madonna is referencing herself from the past, and then people are pointing to different eras of Madonna and these different things in ways that, happens for artists. I mean, Michael Jackson the same way. I think, and even his interaction with Quincy Jones. And here you have like somebody whose history really is in jazz, making the biggest pop record in the world, and those sort of connections and influence, cross-generational aspect of it that you get. Also, when you look at who are producing, even though these artists are new for right now, Weeknd, Dua Lipa, etc., who's producing those records, right? And what are their influences? Where do they sit generationally in the same relationship? Quincy and Michael Jackson, right? Max Martin and all of these people, they're generational. They're actually a generation older than these pop artists.
And also like the 80s were a time where the A&Rs, had a big influence, right? I mean, they were like, it was all about getting the song to, the Billboard #1, right? So the amount of tools that they were created and the production, it's really impressive. I mean, we tend to think, that songs that they were kind of pop sound from the 80s, the production is up. It's like incredible, even better than stuff from the 70s, because that stuff probably doesn't even have mistakes, right? Because it's made with machines. And I just saw someone posting the pitch mode. I mean, in this documentary that I highly recommend, again, the Synth Britannia, they talk about like how like some of their first albums were recorded with one synthesizer, and they use all the sounds from that one specific keyboard that I don't remember which one that were used. But in a way, that I guess that's what it's happening now, that you can have basically that keyword in your phone today, and create an album from at the tip of your fingers, when before you know, if you would have a band, you couldn't do it in a computer. There were no home computers, and you had to go to a studio, right? So
Yeah,
I think
and it's what you
it's
have
such
access
a
to.
combination of like the tools that you have, and whether you're a new musician or whether you're talking pop music, which is what we're really talking about right now, which has, you know, kind of the ultimate, as many tools as you could possibly, you know, put into a genre. Pop is pulling from all of them. And Dario, you also touched on something, you know, talking about whether it's coming from games, or if we look at right now and the work that we do in fitness, you know, there are different modalities and different platforms that people are experiencing music on. And I know, you know, Claire on our team has talked about, you know, pop reaching peak disco. And there's a real movement of digital fitness happening right now. And the industry, I think, is responding to that as well. You know, we've said like pop is on the up. And so it's, you know, it's generational, it's nostalgic, it's tools, and it's also the applications that are using music and what people are asking for.
Well, I think something, I think that these things have happened concurrently and are technically unrelated, but I think it says something looking at that coincidence, right? In that fitness, in the way that we think about it now, came into its own in the 80s, right? If you think about Jane Fonda and VHS workouts and all of that stuff, when did that become big?
Jogging,
In the 80s,
jogging even,
right?
right? I mean,
Yeah, exactly. You know, leg warmers and the whole aesthetic of the 80s is bundled up into fitness, right? And that whole modern fitness movement, that's at-home fitness and, you know, digital fitness, owes its history to that past. You know what I mean? And it is very closely aligned with the music of that period, you know? And so it's something that they have a long shared history. And so the fact that they're both in resurgence at the same time makes a ton of sense.
And another thing, Dario, that you mentioned recently when we were talking about this 80s trend and why it's continuing and why it's sunk its teeth in pop now for a while is, I didn't finish the thought earlier, the socioeconomic situation. You mentioned, which is intuitive, but not something we frequently think about, that oftentimes the pop barometer of which direction it goes, more positive or more negative, is almost opposite in balancing out the overall experience we're having as a culture. And, you know, we're hopefully coming out of that pandemic and things of that nature, but it's still going on. I mean, my son's at home today in the background watching a movie because, you know, God forbid he's got COVID. It's just a cold, but like, we're still dealing with this craziness and it's stressful and we're tired. And many of us are really sad. We're coping with loss. We're coping with all this pent up stress and fear. But, you know, when we talk about early, and I lived through the 80s, I know at least three of us did. Dario, you know as much as we do, but I know you didn't necessarily live through it. But in a sense, you lived through part. But, you know, the early 80s stuff is mostly really joyful and fun and ebullient and like, you know, carefree and just, you know, it's it's joy in a bottle. And, you know, we need that. So when you overlay that dimension into it, I think it makes sense that even, you know, the Weeknd made his stock and trade early in his career. Amazing, amazing music. Still had that sweet, just incredible, effortless voice, but it was so downcast, so dreary, so, you know, negative. And still a lot of his lyrics have that same nihilistic quality to them, or negative, but the musical arrangement that he's put around it is completely flipped around to positive and joyful. And so he's, you know, he's reading the tea leaves and he's also, you know, helping to continue that trend.
Well, it's something we talked about. We've talked about it before a few years ago about, you know, how pop had trended so dark and slow, you know, and the Weeknd example, right? Starboy, that music video is dark, right? It's literally dark. It's just, it's night, it's dark, but blinding lights, it's still night, but right, there's lights, there's all this brightness to it, and that shift, right? If you think about the music that Drake was making pre-pandemic, right? It is slow, it's dark, it's moody, right? Pandemic hits, and now he's, you know, he's hanging out in, you know, in Greek Isles and, you know, and partying, and you know, it's all about, you know, Khaled, and there's this levity and brightness that all of a sudden pops out in this shift, right? And it's where, like you said, music goes from being this exploratory commentary thing to an escapism, you know, and reflecting those needs of the listeners and even the artists themselves, right? And what people are making, you know, which is very different. That's what the 80s is, as opposed to, right, St. Vincent's Reed's album, which is more looking at the 70s, right? And is very dark and moody, and deals with a lot of tough subjects, as opposed to the 80s, which even when they are dark, right? If you look at Tears for Fears, Depeche Mode, like the subject matter isn't always like bright and chipper, right? But there's this sheen over things.
Even Sweet Dreams is pretty dark and kind of like avant-garde subject matter. Sorry to interrupt you, but even that, but they wrap it in that bright musical arrangement.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what Randy just said actually is true in the same sense, right? Like I personally, I was not there, like, but I've read a lot and seen a lot that the 80s doesn't really kick off, and people often use this, right? Like Miami Vice is that sort of, right, that cutout line, that first episode, which is effectively a movie, right? Because it's so long, that pilot, right? And the Phil Collins and the soundtrack, that doesn't come until like 82, 83, right? Like, so it's not like, boom, you hit 1980 and then all the old stuff goes away and new stuff. It takes a shift into that space, and it is until you get a few years into that, which is the same, it's true for the economy, right? Political stuff, all of these things take time to shift, to seep in, to sort of be digested, and then come out the other side, and it makes sense. And now we're 2 years into the pandemic, and now we're 80s is, that revival is now really hitting its stride.
And I also feel that based on the commentary here, the socioeconomic and the cultural aspects, with the pandemic, we had to shut down pretty much everything, right? And but people, I think artists rather, are also trying to find a way how to expose their music. And maybe it's an assumption, but I think there are a lot of artists that are realizing that fitness is a place where they can deliver new music, because there is an audience there. We cannot go to dance, we cannot go to parties right now. I mean, we will hopefully, but at the moment, these artists, they need to try to find a way to express themselves, obviously make money and be relevant. And music and fitness, that's why I guess they're taking a turn into something more upbeat and something that sounds familiar, because fitness is for everybody, right? It really, we cover from 20-year-olds to 60-year-olds, or whatever. I mean, it's not that. But I think there is some
right.
Well, that there are musicians trying to get into which as we talked in other episodes, are we having influencers, music influencers in the fitness community, being instructors, or instructors or DJs as well. So
yeah, I think artists are definitely thinking about. Oh, sorry, Dario. I think artists are definitely talking about the platforms that they're going to be hearing,
right.
heard on, and they're also looking at the tools, right? When you go back to the Eurythmics, during a pandemic, it's tough to get a big band together, to make things happen. So I think those tools are more readily available, whether you're a new artist or established, and what do I got around the house? What do I have access to? I think all of those definitely come into play.
Yeah, mediums drive creativity in that way. If you're for fitness, right? If you're making it for TV and movies, if it's specifically for touring, right? The Beatles' music takes a big shift when they're not touring anymore. They don't have to worry about that, right? And that's a medium shift, right? Versus being, live on a TV show or in an arena versus, on a record or in that space, and when your medium shifts from clubs and arenas to digital fitness, that's going to take a shift to the way that and what you're making.
Yeah. Well, I know we're running out of time here, but what a wide range of things. So if you came to the show wondering why there's an 80s sound revival, I think we've given you a lot to chew on. It's everything from nostalgia, generational nostalgia, tools that are available, technology, these cycles. There's just so much that comes into play. But I'd love to just, kind of wrap up with you guys sharing, some of the albums or hits that have come out that you feel really embody this the most. I know we've talked a little bit about The Weeknd. Who else has brought this to the forefront in pop music right now, and what are some of the standout tracks?
I think Dua Lipa, it's definitely right there with The Weeknd, because of the sound, the tempo, and the attitude. I know that there've been some comparisons to, I guess, but it's more specifically to songs, like that song Bad Habits from Ed Sheeran, is very similar to Bronski Beat's Small Town Boy. So, but it's because, this usage of, computers with very similar sounds. So,
I mean, we talked about "Kiss Me More," the Doja Cat and SZA
Yeah.
song. That literally the chorus is physical, right? And
From
that,
Olivia
which is,
Newton-John.
yeah, exactly, which is also like, key, fitness, and dance in that sense. But that pulling, that's a direct reference. They're saying, hey, here is our 80s influence right here. We're literally showing it to you in a mirror. But I think for me personally, Jessie Ware's "What's Your Pleasure" album, it combines the best of that 70s into the 80s influence of disco, but has those sounds and synthesizers and those arrangements and does it in a way that also isn't. I think the best ones, right, from Jessie Ware to even The Weeknd and Dua Lipa, aren't just regurgitating the 80s. It sounds new. You couldn't make it in the 80s. I think there are plenty of people put in albums that, although they sound good and sound 80s, there's nothing fresh or new about it. But that Jessie Ware album, to me, it's very much now. It's like if you took somebody from the 80s, pulled them into now, gave them a little while, and then said, okay, make an album.
I love that.
Well, what I was going to say is that I don't know if I can necessarily point out one specific artist or song, but what I would suggest people do is go and Google music used in the new season of Euphoria, because the music supervisors are doing a kick-ass job of blending music that's 80s sounding but current. And also, I mean, this last episode, this past Sunday, they used the song from Depeche Mode, Echo and the Bunnymen, Erasure, Roxette, and INXS. But they mixed it with new stuff that sounds kind of like that too. So you can get a whole playlist worth of stuff right from that.
I love it.
I'm gonna dodge that question a bit because my colleagues have covered it so well, and I just say Dario is ditto as usual, as are these other gentlemen. But I think what's interesting to me right now, with the cycle starting to overlap and recur upon one another, is that the 90s have been starting to emerge over just the last couple of years, and I think we're going to continue to see this 80s sound for sure, but starting to envelop some distinctly 90s trends with rock, which has been publicized a lot, and guitars coming back, like Olivia Rodrigo. Clearly, she's a student of the 90s. You've got more underground artists like Snail Mail. You've got other people popping up from the woodwork, like this young artist, Gail, and a lot of other things happening. And I just think that Travis Barker actually he deserves the call out. The former Blink-182 drummer, which is making power moves right now in the pop space and collaborating with anyone and their cousin who, and I say that because he's an open slate, right? He'll collaborate with whatever, but he's putting that distinctly 90s flavor into it with these younger artists. And so I think that combination of 80s and 90s is going to be a really interesting space for pop music.
Hyperpop is doing is that too, right? It is more leaning into that, the 90s of like trance and like all of these other things, and what it's pulling from a lot of those 90s electronica and dance aesthetics with pop music. I feel like that's definitely the sort of undercurrent for the 90s, is in both in indie rock, and then also in like hyperpop and those sorts of movements.
Well, this has been great. We love all the comments coming in from the social channels. So please, continue to tune in. This is Inside Music Curation. We are Feed Media Group. We handle music curation for some of the world's largest fitness brands, as well as other folks. And we're back here every other week talking about all of the themes in Inside Music Curation. You can watch the back videos on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And we hope to see you guys soon. If you have any questions or want to check us out more, we're on feedmediagroup.com. Thank you so much, Arturo, Mike, Stens, Dario, for lending your expertise to the conversation again.
Thank you, Melissa.
Melissa.